eyes are on Ottawa this week, as Prime Minister-designate Mark Carney gets set to take on the role officially and swear in a new cabinet and get things in place for a widely expected election call. Here's some of the moves he and his team are making and what people are talking about. Former Public Safety Minister Marco Mendicino will serve as Chief of Staff on a temporary basis, and former Privy Council clerk, that's the top bureaucrat in the country, Janice Charette, is leading Carney's transition team. As for cabinet, lots of focus on current top ministers and where they end up, including Anita Anand, who, of course, said she wouldn't run in the next election, then decided to run just a few weeks ago. Bill Blair, François-Philippe Champagne, Mélanie Joly, Dominic LeBlanc, and David McGuinty are some other top names that people are looking at. There's also speculation Carney could fold in some former politicians who don't currently hold office, notably former Quebec Liberal Premier and federal Progressive Conservative leader Jean Charest, as well as former BC Premier Christy Clark. According to his campaign, Carney has also now divested all of his assets other than his personal real estate into a blind trust. So what does all of that tell us about the next few days and few weeks and how they could unfold? Let's bring back the front bench: Brian Gallant, Lisa Raitt, Tom Mulcair, and Rob Benzie. Tama, I'll start with you on the possibility of someone like Jean Charest, who has reportedly said no, but was asked to perform some role in some capacity, or Christy Clark, or other people who would just be appointed to cabinet or serve in sort of an advisory role. What do you think? What kind of message would they be trying to send with something like that?
Mark Carney has such a sweet position with regard to naming people directly into safe Liberal ridings. Several cabinet ministers, several MPs have said they're not coming back. I don't see why he would sully himself. A lot of Canadians are already asking, well, how is a guy who's never been elected able to become Prime Minister? Well, the answer is that's the Westminster system, fine. But if he starts going against the grain of that system, it's not illegal, it is allowed constitutionally, and naming people who have not been elected to what would essentially be a caretaker position, I think he'd be working against himself. He has that sweet spot. He can go and recruit people from the sports world, from entertainment, from the business world. He can go and get top-notch folks. They would be his star candidates. They would represent the change, because the danger for him, of course, since he has to stay with the bulk of the cabinet that was there under Trudeau, is the Conservatives get to say, aha, you see, we told you it's the same gang. So that's his opportunity. This idea would look more like a stunt than anything else if we were to go and bring in some people like that. Christy Clark, fabulous candidate for them, great catch for the next election, but give her a safe riding and tell her to go ahead and get herself elected, and she can be in cabinet if they form the government, of course.
Lisa, your thoughts on, I guess, if there is a message they're able to deliver with cabinet, what should it be? Like, like the runway is short to the next election. There's not going to be a huge opportunity in advance of the campaign to do a lot of stuff. But if it is, for example, the way in which you make your cabinet, what message should they be trying to send?
That they're as distant as possible from the Trudeau government. I really think that's the key for him, but he doesn't really have the latitude to do so. He's going to have to be explaining why Mélanie Joly is still there, why Chrystia Freeland's in the cabinet, why Bill Blair is there. I see, and François-Philippe Champagne, I see them still remaining in their jobs for good reason. If you're going to be in the next 6 weeks in an election campaign, there is still a minister that needs to be in place. And the minister is consulted in times of difficulty, when the caretaker convention is something that isn't quite sufficient in dealing with a matter. So you still have to have a steady hand. Having a newbie on the file, I don't think makes sense. But Mark Carney's going to have to explain why he's doing what he's doing. So I offer no advice on that, but the danger of picking the same old gives a great tee-off point for the Conservatives and lots of narrative for us to push with.
Yeah, I think that certainly one of the primary narratives that the Conservatives have in their press conferences and through their ads, Brian, tried to send a message on is around linking, Justin Trudeau and Mark Carney. So the things that you were upset about with Justin Trudeau are the same things you're going to be upset about with Mark Carney. And Carney has countered by talking a lot about how he isn't a politician, how he doesn't have a history in politics, and he's characterized himself and his campaign did as an outsider. Do you think it matters in the interim before an election what kind of moves he makes to distance himself from Trudeau? Does he have the ability to do so, really?
I agree with Tom. I agree with Lisa. I think the dynamics that they laid out are exactly what is at play. If the election is indeed going to be called in a week or whatever, give or take, as we're all sort of hearing the rumors, he only has a few news cycles, and a cabinet shuffle will be one of the major ones. There's no question, if maybe even arguably the biggest one. So sending a message or attempting to send a message through the appointments to cabinet makes sense. Trying to distance himself from the past makes sense. Lisa's points about how that will be difficult, totally. And your preamble to the question, will that be something the Tories sort of bank on? Yes, absolutely, because they were doing so well for a year and a half with that type of message. So if they can bring that back, at least bring that in the minds of some back, they feel, I'm sure, that they'll be able to get the polling to sort of go in the direction that they would like to see it. That said, it's not as easy as it is if you have the same leader, the same prime minister, because I do think people really attribute their view towards a party and a government based on the leader. Are there other factors? Of course, platform, performance, right? Messaging, yes. But at the end of the day, it's the leader that is typically the main issue, the main thing that the public will use to judge that party and where it's going.
So much of what's unfolding up here in Ottawa, Rob, makes me think of the Ontario campaign, and in particular, the way in which Ford was able to leverage his role as premier during that campaign, right? Two visits to Washington, sort of governing while campaigning. Is that going to be the case, do you think, or potentially the case for Carney as well, an attempt to leverage that?
Yeah, I think, actually, that's exactly it. If Mark Carney is smart, he will use the Doug Ford playbook, run against Donald Trump, and it may help him. It'll certainly help him here in Ontario. Ford gives Carney a bit of a halo. That's why one of the first things Carney's doing is coming to Toronto to meet with the Premier of Ontario, even though they're in different political parties. That's why Premier Doug Ford was one of the first to congratulate, or the first to congratulate Mr. Carney when he won. It's good for Mr. Ford politically if the federal Tories aren't doing well. That we know this is a historic conceit. When one party's in power federally, they're usually a different party in power provincially at Queen's Park. And Mr. Ford is mindful of that. So if it's good for Mark Carney, it's probably good for Doug Ford. And if it's good for Doug Ford, it's probably good for Mark Carney. So this is why these next few days are going to be very interesting. And I think that it's intriguing that Mr. Carney is letting names like Jean Charest float as potential cabinet members, because that tells you that he's willing to think outside the box. We've seen this movie before. Remember Stephen Harper, when he was first elected, brought in David Emerson, who had been a Liberal cabinet minister, into his first cabinet. And in 1996, the first cabinet shuffle I ever covered, Stéphane Dion and Pierre Pettigrew were not MPs. Jean Chrétien brought them into cabinet because he had to shore up Quebec after the near miss in the 1995 referendum. So if you think outside the box like Mr. Carney appears to be prepared to do, whether it's floating Christy Clark or Jean Charest or whatever, that makes it difficult for the Tories to say he's just like Justin. Well, maybe he's not.
Back to the point about whether or not he's going to, use the ability to govern, Tom. What kind of challenge does that present, not just the Conservative, but any opposition party? Like we saw in the Ontario election as well, it was a challenge for both opposition parties.
Yeah, but the only person who can do any governing will be the Prime Minister.
Yeah.
I mean, for the reasons that Lisa and I set out, I mean, you are into this caretaker phase. Yeah. And, prorogation ends in less than 2 weeks. So it's a very short timeline, and it's still mystifying that we don't have dates given for the three things that have to take place at Rideau Hall, which is the resignation of Mr. Trudeau, the swearing in of Mr. Carney, and signing in of the new cabinet. So it is a bit hard to understand. Mr. Carney will be able to play from Doug Ford's playbook, because even though people complain, well, he has to have some government resources in this, it can't only be campaign, and what's going on here, is that even fair? Fair schmear. I mean, he was a steamroller, and he used that presence in the United States to really springboard forward his whole campaign. I think that Carney might just be able to do that. You could imagine that during that very brief period, he'd have a visit to Brussels or Paris or maybe, London, and then he would be able to show himself on a stage where he's played before. And that might help him indeed. But I can't see any of those ministers except for the trio that are right now handling the United States. Right. That's to say, LeBlanc, Joly, and Champagne. Would Carney show some grace and appoint Chrystia Freeland as part of that team? Remains to be seen. I think it might be a smart move for him to do that.
Oh, that'll be interesting. I'd be surprised, but we shall see maybe in the next few days. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate the discussion. Our front bench, Brian Gallant, Lisa Raitt, Tom Mulcair, and Rob Benzie.